Standing at the ship's rail, observing the preliminary bombardment, Colonel Louis B. Chesty Puller harbored serious doubts. Before him stretched Peleliu, a tiny coral speck within the Palau island chain. Though Marines had received assurances that the U.S. Navy had saturated every square inch with thousands of artillery rounds, Puller remained unconvinced that the Battle of Peleliu would prove as simple as others claimed. Ascending to the ship's bridge for his goodbyes, Puller encountered a Navy captain who casually inquired whether he'd return for dinner. Puller didn't share the naval officer's optimism regarding a swift victory. "If you believe it's so effortless, why not join me on the beach at 5 o'clock for dinner and collect some mementos?" he retorted sharply. Puller's apprehension about the approaching Battle of Peleliu proved prescient. The invasion would rank among the most devastating encounters Marines would face throughout World War II. By 1944, though remaining a dangerous adversary, the Japanese had shifted to defensive tactics. At Impal and Kohima, British and Commonwealth forces had stopped Japanese advances and begun pushing them toward central Burma. Meanwhile, America had captured the Solomon Islands, Tarawa in the Gilbert Chain, New Britain in the Admiralties, plus Guam, Tinian, and Saipan in the Marianas. The Allies now sought additional staging grounds to support future invasions and, ultimately, the conquest of Japan's homeland. President Franklin D. Roosevelt eventually accepted General Douglas MacArthur's argument that the Luzon Late strategy for defeating the Japanese Empire offered the most viable approach. Initially, capturing Morotai was crucial to shield MacArthur's left flank from Japanese air attacks. Seizing Peleliu and Angkor would protect his right flank. The mission was designated Stalemate. Multiple islands within the Palau group attracted planners' attention. This archipelago extended over 100 miles and contained numerous islands. Babel Thwap was the largest and possessed an airfield. However, it was quickly eliminated as a target. Reconnaissance revealed the airstrip remained under construction and couldn't be expanded. Additionally, the island was extremely rugged and heavily fortified. Complicating matters further, the U.S. Army's 77th Division, initially assigned to the operation, required reassignment to Guam. Stalemate was abandoned. A new directive emerged titled Stalemate II. The U.S. Army's 7th and 96th Divisions formed the Eastern Attack Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Theodore S. Wilkinson. They would advance on Ulithi and Yap, their revised objectives. The U.S. Army's 81st Infantry Division, nicknamed the Wildcats, alongside the 1st Marine Division, would constitute the Western Attack Force, led by Rear Admiral George Ford. The Wildcats received orders to take Angkor. Marines were assigned Peleliu. Peleliu, among the southernmost islands in the chain, already possessed a functioning airdrome and received priority status. Furthermore, the smaller island of Ngesivis, situated off Peleliu's northern shore and linked by a causeway, contained an auxiliary fighter airfield. Located merely 7 miles from Peleliu's southern tip, Angkor was also selected for potential airstrips capable of accommodating larger bomber aircraft. On maps, Peleliu resembled a lobster's claw. Approximately 20 square miles in area, it was surrounded by a fringing reef nearly 1,000 yards wide. The southern section, containing the airfield, was relatively flat and open. Along the airfield's eastern edge lay a dense mangrove swamp. To the west and south, stretched scrub jungle liberally scattered with wild coconuts and occasional grass-covered clearings. In the upper claw center, just north of the airstrip, stood a series of coral ridges covered by thick jungle, known as the Umurbrogol Mountains. Several primary roads, originating from the airstrip, crossed the upper claw's eastern and western coasts. They eventually converged in the north and terminated at a calico village. Here stood a phosphate plant, radio station, and a hand-operated narrow-gauge railroad. On the claw's lower pincer, the Japanese had constructed a radio direction finder and power plant. The Marines' primary concern was Umurbrogol Mountain. There was never any doubt in the minds of 1st Division planners that the high ground north of the airfield represented the island's key terrain feature, stated Brig. General O.P. Smith, 1st Marine Division Assistant Commander. One advantage favoring the Leathernecks was the enemy's troop deployment on Peleliu. When Saipan fell to Marine and Army units in July, Numerous files were captured. Saipan had served as headquarters for the Japanese 31st Army. The enemy maintained meticulous record-keeping habits. The Japanese didn't disappoint the Marines. These documents identified units stationed at Peleliu and nearby Ngesabis Island. Approximately 25,000 enemy soldiers occupied the Palaus. The core of enemy strength on Peleliu was the 14th Division, among the finest units in the Japanese Imperial Army. It comprised the 2nd Infantry Regiment, including one artillery battalion, the 3rd Battalion, 15th Infantry, including one 75mm artillery battalion, an 81mm mortar company, and 155mm mortar company, a tank unit containing 17 tanks, plus mixed supporting units. Additionally, the 53rd Independent Mixed Brigade, one independent infantry battalion, and typical naval and construction personnel completed the troop complement. Leading the 14th Division was Lt. General Seide Inoue, a stable and competent if uninspired officer. His orders, issued by War Minister Hideki Tojo before departing Tokyo, were straightforward. The islands must be defended to the last man. This was the first position preventing enemy penetration of the Pacific. Peleliu and Angkor must be fortified as vital air bases. While Anu's headquarters operated from Kor, 25 miles southwest of Peleliu, Colonel Nakagawa commanded Peleliu's units directly. Upon arriving in April 1944, he immediately began fortifying the island's defenses. A document titled Palau Group Sector Training for Victory was sent to Nakagawa for implementation. Though issued by Inoue, it was later revealed that the talented Colonel Tokechi Tada, Inu's chief of staff, actually authored the document. In total, over 10,000 Japanese soldiers awaited the Marines on Peleliu. Inoue also dispatched Maj. General Kenjiro Mirai to Peleliu, raising an intriguing question. Why did a colonel command ground forces when a major general was present? This wasn't answered until years later when Lt. Col. Wade W. Worden, a Peleliu campaign veteran, questioned Inoue while he was imprisoned at a naval facility on Guam. He told Worden that Mirai was sent to Peleliu as insurance because it was considered crucial and, most importantly, to manage the Navy. A Japanese flag officer, Vice Admiral Itu, was stationed on Peleliu, and Mirai would hold equal rank. Inoue recognized that the Army and Navy were at bitter odds, and the general's presence would buffer relations between Themen and Nakagawa. In the Umurbrogol, the Japanese army on Peleliu had been excavating like moles to create their defenses. Using natural coral outcroppings that extended over 5,000 yards from the airstrip to Hill 80 in the northern region, they constructed a monster Swiss cheese, riddled with caves and crevices. Some were tiny, accommodating only a single rifleman. Others were enormous, housing entire battalions. Each cavern received a letter designation and served specific purposes. Most featured multiple entrances and exits and were ingeniously concealed. Additionally, to protect occupants from gunfire and concussion from larger shells, sharp turns and small slots were carved into many cave walls. In Peleliu's northern section, the 214th Naval Construction Battalion built some of the more elaborate caves. Most men in this unit had been miners and tunnel workers before the war began. Most of their dwellings featured electric lighting, ventilation systems, and medical facilities. In stark contrast to the Army, which preferred utilizing natural formations for their fortifications, the Japanese Navy built theirs from scratch, free from the cluttering stalactites and stalagmites found in Army caves. Either way, through blasting or the more laborious digging method, over 500 caves were subsequently identified. The exact number will never be known. Nakagawa had divided the island into 4 defensive sectors with 2 battalions defending each. He anticipated that Marines would land in the southwest section of Peleliu due to the all-important airstrip's proximity. Here he positioned his heavy artillery and massive naval guns. Anti-aircraft weapons and light and heavy machine guns protected the airfield. Beach approaches were scattered with hundreds of mines. The island bristled with 37mm and 75mm anti-tank guns, rifle pits, anti-tank ditches, and reinforced concrete pillboxes. All automatic weapons had established interlocking fields of fire. Nakagawa had exercised great care in establishing the island's defenses. He was determined to kill as many Marines as possible. While the Japanese busily prepared for the inevitable assault, the 1st Marine Division staff worked equally hard. After careful consideration, the initial landing would occur in the island's southwest area, with elements of 3 regiments landing abreast. Coming ashore on White 1 and 2 would be 2 battalions of Colonel Louis B. Chesty Puller's 1st Marines, code-named Spitfire. The remaining battalion would be held in regimental reserve. Their mission was to push inland past the barracks area, turn left, and assault the Umurbrogol Mountains nose. 2 battalions from the 5th Marines Lone Wolf would land on Orange 1 and 2, linking with the 1st Marines on their left and striking straight ahead toward the eastern shore. Led by Colonel Harold D. Bucky Harris, the other battalion would disembark 1 hour later, advance between the other 2, and attack across the airfield's lower end. After securing the airstrip, they would begin moving on the flat northeastern peninsula and small offshore islands. Finally, the 7th Marines Mustang would hit Orange Beach 3 with 2 battalions following each other. Commanded by Colonel Herman H. Hot-headed Hannikin, the Marines would then wheel right and attack the enemy at the southern promontories. 1 reinforced battalion would remain as regimental reserve. Undoubtedly, Puller's 1st Marines had drawn the short straw. The white beaches were flanked by a low coral bluff on the left and a tiny peninsula on the right, wrote author John Hoffman in his book Chesty, The Story of Lieutenant General Louis B. Puller, USMC. Beoth offered the enemy positions from which to direct deadly enfilade fire down the length of the regiment as it splashed ashore. Aerial photos had not revealed any defensive works at either place, but the Japanese were noted for their skill at camouflage. Senior officers in the 1st Marines were concerned about the danger and asked that these sites receive strong attention during the pre-landing bombardment. Puller himself repeated the request at a final planning conference after the rehearsals. If many within the division had serious doubts about the Peleliu campaign's length and ferocity, one did not: the 1st Marine Division commander, Maj. General William H. Rupertus. The balding but dapper leader had over 30 years in the Marine Corps and had served at various duty stations. Described as a moody individual, which some believe was caused by the tragic deaths of his wife and children from scarlet fever years before, Rupertus did not maintain good working relationships with his subordinate officers. In fact, some called him Rupe the Stoop and quietly questioned his leadership abilities. Just prior to the invasion, Rupertus suffered an unfortunate accident that left him with a broken ankle. When Maj. General Roy S. Geiger, head of the 3 Marine Amphibious Corps, learned of Rupertus's injury, he was quite concerned and even considered not allowing him to participate in the operation. Brigadier General O.P. Smith intervened and assured Geiger that Rupertus's ankle would heal sufficiently to permit him to carry on. Rupertus demonstrated nothing but contempt for the U.S. Army troops assigned to Stalemate II. Although the U.S. Army's 81st Division had yet to see combat, they had trained extensively and were in excellent condition for the upcoming assault. Much of their esprit de corps came from their leader, Maj. General Paul Mueller, a West Point graduate and World War I hero. Despite this, Rupertus wanted Peleliu to be entirely a Marine operation. Just prior to D-Day, a letter was circulated by Rupertus explaining his enthusiasm about the invasion. He expected the operation to resemble Tarawa, fast but furious, and anticipated that Peleliu would be captured within 4 days. This unrealistic prediction was to color tactical thinking ashore for a month to follow. Most officers believed this unusual document intended in the nature of a pep talk, wrote Major Frank O. Huff, USMCR, in his monograph The Assault on Peleliu. This was not its effect on the news correspondents. However, many of the 36 accredited to the division did not come ashore at all, and only 6, one of whom was killed, chose to stay through the critical early phases. Hence, news coverage of the operation was sketchy, often misleading, and when quick conquest failed to materialize, tinged with biting criticism. Despite disagreement over the campaign's length, the raggedy-ass Marines of the 1st Division were considered by many to be the finest amphibious unit in the Pacific theater. They already had 2 successful operations to their credit. Guadalcanal, and Cape Gloucester. Since Gloucester had ended, however, the division had been sent to Pavuvu for rest and recuperation R&R. Many were disappointed because the regiment had their previous R&R in Australia. Located in the Russell Islands, Pavuvu was described as a rain-soaked, rat-infested chunk of real estate. In addition to being a wretched place, Pavuvu's terrain had nothing in common with that of Peleliu. Despite these drawbacks, the Leathernecks made the best of it. As replacements arrived and training began, the older veterans passed on their knowledge to the fresh recruits. As months passed, morale rebounded. Sick cases began to diminish, and the unit was imbued with renewed spirit. Or perhaps, as many firmly believed, all hands were simply so disgusted with Pavuvu that they welcomed the opportunity to vent their resentment on the Japanese, wrote Huff. A severe shortage in various types of gear was another serious problem the Marines faced. The harsh jungle conditions of the Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester campaigns had greatly reduced their amphibian tractors, flamethrowers, bazookas, Browning automatic rifles and communication equipment. These items required quick replacement. The 1st Marine Division had no experience landing across a wide fringing reef. All their operations had been in jungle environments. Considerable training was required in launching of amphibian tractors and DUKW's amphibious trucks from landing ship, tanks LSTs at sea, transfer of troops from landing craft to vehicles in deep water, advance in waves across the Coral, and quick formation of the land assault once disembarked, wrote Huff. The division began receiving the newer LVTA-1 or amphibian tank for training. By early August, however, the newer LVTA-4 started arriving. The newer vehicle featured a 75mm snub-nose gun mounting instead of the 37mm on the 1 model. Of the nearly 900 men in the 1st Amphibious Tractor Battalion, about 50 were familiar with the tank. It would be an insult to the intelligence of a military-minded reader to say that the battalion was sufficiently trained and indoctrinated to carry out its mission, wrote Lt. Col. Kimber H. Boyer, 3rd Armored Amphibian Battalion Commander. It can be considered some sort of miracle that the initial phase of the operation was not seriously disrupted. Despite the many setbacks and problems encountered by the Leathernecks, the division was as prepared as possible for the invasion. The training phase was over. Nakagawa's men were waiting. In early September, 30 LSTs steamed from Cape Esperance in the Solomon Islands, where the Marines had participated in their final training exercise for the upcoming Battle of Peleliu. The assault companies and their supporting units were crammed into the flat-bottomed vessels. The heat was oppressive. While the Leathernecks were being transported to their objective, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's aircraft carriers of Task Force 38 struck the Palaus on September 6-8. On September 12th, his naval group attacked the central Philippines, shot down 173 Japanese planes, and eliminated another 305 that were on the ground. 3rd Fleet Commander Admiral William F. Bull Halsey was struck by the obvious absence of Japanese air power. He dispatched a cable to Admiral Chester A. Nimitz, commander of the Central Pacific area, recommending that the Yap and Palau operations be canceled. The assault forces designated for those campaigns could be given to MacArthur for the Philippine invasion. Halsey also recommended that the attack on Leyte in the Philippines be rescheduled from December to October, 2 months earlier. The memo was forwarded to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who were attending the Octagon Conference in Quebec, Canada, with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. MacArthur could not be reached for his comments, but his Chief of Staff, Lt. General R.K. Sutherland, agreed with Halsey's recommendations and was certain MacArthur would concur with the new timetable. Consequently, the Yap assault was canceled, and the Leyte operation was now scheduled for October 20th. The Eastern Attack Force was diverted to Manus Island and joined MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Army. The Western Attack Force, however, was to continue with its assignment of seizing Peleliu, Ulithi, and Angkor. Nimitz had excluded that part of the message to the Joint Chiefs because he felt the right flank needed protection. The invasion forces were already at sea, he said, and the commitment already made to phase I precluded calling off the invasion. The original plan called for only 2 days of naval gunfire for the pre-landing bombardment of Peleliu. That was modified, and the Marines were given another day. This was to include the elimination of any enemy aircraft on the ground and artillery installations and raising as many strongpoints as possible. Because of the nearness of the other islands where additional troops could reinforce Nakagawa's garrison, naval gunfire was to destroy any barges, sampans, and ships that could accomplish this mission. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's heavy strike force of 4 battleships, plus numerous cruisers and destroyers, unleashed a tremendous barrage of 16-inch, 14-inch, and 5-inch shells on Peleliu. This salvo destroyed most of the above-ground structures, such as the barracks, hangars, and utility and administrative buildings. But unknown to Oldendorf, his bombardment, although awesome to be sure, had a negligible effect on the defenders burrowed underground. Rupertus and Lt. Col. Lewis J. Fields, the division operations officer, were shocked when Oldendorf radioed saying he had run out of targets. Their reaction was that of incredulity, wrote Lt. Col. F.A. Ramsey, Jr., a member of the division staff. It was not only a surprise, but was not understood by any of us. In view of the study and requirements we had submitted, and the plans which had been so carefully prepared and agreed to as essential, despite their condemnation of the pre-invasion bombardment, the Marines had to settle for the 3 days the Navy provided. The rest was up to the infantry. The devastating pounding of Peleliu did not shake Nakagawa's men in the least. As the invasion forces closed in on the island, morale was never higher. "The enemy is planned to land," one Japanese soldier wrote in his diary captured after the battle. "Let them come if they're coming. Who is afraid of the Americans or the British? We will defend Peleliu." At first light on September 15th, the Japanese defenders of Peleliu saw the unmistakable silhouettes of hundreds of U.S. ships offshore. It was a clear, calm morning, and the Marines at least had the advantage of a placid sea for the assault. Underwater demolition teams UDT had done a remarkable job of clearing the approaches to the beaches and scouting the reef. Naval guns trained their sights on the islands and sent round after round crashing into the terrain. Just before 8 a.m., carrier aircraft raked the landing beaches to remove any gun emplacements. The LVTs transporting the first waves of infantry formed their line of departure about 4,000 yards offshore. The amphibian tanks of the 3rd Armored Amphibian Battalion preceded the LVTs to provide covering fire for them. Also, 18 landing craft infantry LCI vessels fired their 4.5-inch rockets in support. More U.S. Navy fighter bombers unleashed their ordnance on the beach as the heavier guns of the ships offshore began walking their shells inland. All of this firepower had obscured Peleliu's view. "Nothing could live through that," remarked one Marine. His words would prove to be wrong. As the dust and smoke began to clear, Lt. Col. H.C. Churji watched the fireworks display from a transport. To everyone's dismay, Japanese artillery and mortar fire began shelling the landing craft as they hit the beach. He later commented, "I'd never seen combat before, and the first thing that struck me was that this was a hell of a way to treat $40,000 equipment." Enfilading fire had indeed zeroed in on the Marines as they stormed ashore. As the infantrymen drove inland, enemy resistance became increasingly more difficult. On the 4th wave, the Sherman medium tanks of Company A, 1st Tank Battalion, took hits from hidden enemy gun emplacements. Of the 18 tanks, only 1 landed unscathed. By day's end, only 5 Shermans were still operational. The ping of bullets ricocheting off the Amtraks could be heard from the occupants as they lurched onto the beaches. Some of the tracked vehicles took direct hits. Arms, legs, heads, guts, and brains went flying, recalled PFC Charles Doolittle of the 5th Marines. Peleliu was a nightmare of flashes, violent explosions, and snapping bullets, wrote PFC Eugene B. Sledge, a mortarman with Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. From the outset, Puller's men had the roughest going on the white beaches. Japanese shells killed and destroyed much of the 1st Marines' communications and its operators. It would be later in the day before radio contact was established between Puller's command post CP and the division. On White 2, the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines pushed inland against moderate resistance. The 3rd Battalion, however, ran into a maelstrom of Japanese mortar and automatic weapons fire. Hardest hit was Company K, led by Captain George P. Hunt. His 225-man unit was given the unenviable task of securing a promontory called the Point. In his personal account, Coral Comes High, a book he wrote after the war, Hunt described the point. It rose 30 feet above the water's edge. It was solid, jagged coral, sharp pinnacles, deep crevices, and tremendous boulders. Pillboxes, reinforced with steel and concrete, had been dug or blasted in the base of the perpendicular drop to the beach. Others, with coral and concrete piled 6 feet on top, were constructed above, and spider holes were blasted around them for protecting infantry. It surpassed by far anything we had conceived of when we studied the aerial photographs. For nearly 2 hours, Hunt's Marines hurled themselves against the point. This enclave had to be taken to eliminate the devastating fire pouring down on the riflemen still coming ashore. Lieutenant William A. Willis tossed a smoke grenade near an opening that contained a 47mm cannon. Meanwhile, Corporal Robert Anderson fired several rifle grenades from his M1. The second one exploded and ignited the ammunition stored in the enclosure. Screaming enemy soldiers raced from the pillbox and were immediately cut down. Hunt's men had secured the point. However, the cost was not cheap. Hunt's second platoon had become isolated, and he was unaware of their casualties. He wasted no time in establishing a perimeter with the remnants of his 1st and 3rd platoons. All he had were 32 Marines. Realizing Company K was stranded atop the point, Lt. Col. Stephen Sabal, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines Commander, quickly dispatched Company L to plug the gap between Hunt and Company I. Japanese gunners kept the pressure on, and the reinforcements were unable to reach Company K. Hunt's men were stranded and on their own. In the center, the 5th Marines had an easier time, meeting only scattered resistance. Harris's Leathernecks drove into Peleliu's interior and secured their first objective by mid-morning. One slight mishap did occur. Elements from the 7th Marines inadvertently went ashore on Orange 2 instead of Orange 3, delaying the advance of Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The error was quickly corrected, and the momentum was soon regained. On Orange 1, Corporal Lewis K. Bowsel's squad inched forward to eradicate Japanese defensive positions in some thick scrub. Fanatical enemy soldiers ran out clutching grenades, killing themselves and wounding nearby Marines. One soldier tossed a grenade from an opening that fell near Bowsel and several other riflemen. He immediately flung himself on the device. Miraculously, Bowsel survived the explosion but died later of his wounds. His was the first of 8 medals of honor awarded to the Marines who fought in the Battle of Peleliu. While the 1st and 5th Marines were slugging it out, the 7th Marines ran into a large number of natural and man-made obstacles on the beach. These obstructions diverted the Amtraks to the left, causing confusion, which took time to rectify. A massive anti-tank ditch was used for a CP and provided cover for the advancing infantry. Peleliu's beaches were strewn with discarded equipment, burning vehicles, and mangled bodies. Life magazine correspondent and artist Tom Leah witnessed a wounded Marine stumbling toward the beach. His face was half bloody pulp, and the mangled shreds of what was left of an arm hung down like a stick, he later wrote. By late morning, the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines had gained approximately 500 yards. Their advance was soon impeded, however, by a stronghold of enemy pillboxes and blockhouses near the barracks area. The clanking of the Sherman tanks announced their arrival, but they mistakenly began to support the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Soon a gap developed between the two units, which was not closed until later in the afternoon. By late afternoon, dust from moving vehicles could be seen in the distance. "Nip tanks," yelled one Marine. He was right. 13 light Japanese tanks were approaching the location of the 1st and 5th Marines. Snipers rode atop the armored vehicles, and infantry followed behind them. The Marines opened up with everything they had: 75mm howitzers, 37mm guns, bazookas, and heavy machine guns tore into the invading force. Most of the Japanese tanks were set ablaze, but 2, however, did manage to penetrate the perimeter and were quickly eliminated. This was the only large, organized attack during the struggle for Peleliu. Throughout the battle, the enemy remained hidden. Nightfall was uneventful as the expected banzai attack never materialized. Minor incursions and penetrations took place all along the lines. Lt. Col. Lewis W. Walt executive officer of the 5th Marines, had taken over command when Lt. Col. Austin Schaffner was wounded in a mortar attack. Walt, accompanied only by a runner, crawled out beyond the 5th Marines' lines, located each unit, and brought some semblance of order to the perimeter. For this outstanding achievement, he was awarded the Navy Cross. It had been a bad day for the 1st Marine Division, wrote Richard Wheeler in his book, A Special Valor, the U.S. Marines in the Pacific War. Casualties numbered 1,111 killed, wounded, and missing. There were also numerous cases of combat fatigue and heat prostration. General Rupertus was troubled not only by the high casualties but also by the fact that the beachhead embraced less than half the southern part of the island, when he had expected to take the entire region by nightfall. He began to rue his prophecy that the campaign would be a brief one, and this was just the first day. The Japanese on Peleliu had employed a new technique that was to set the precedent for future amphibious operations in the Pacific. The Leathernecks watched for some crack in morale, but none was forthcoming. Nakagawa's troops were the best Japan had to offer and would not make many mistakes during the campaign. By the next day, D+1 artillery from the 11th Marines began registering their guns to the relief of the infantry. Just before 10 a.m., General Rupertus hobbled ashore and went to the division CP set up by Smith the previous day in the anti-tank ditch on Orange 2. He was agitated at the lack of movement of the 1st Marines and pressured Puller. "Goddamn it, Louis, you gotta kick ass to get results," he yelled. Ultimately, the strain of the Peleliu campaign would have a devastating effect on Rupertus. He confided in one staff officer near the end of the fighting, "This thing has just about got me beat." He would return stateside and die as a result of heart failure in March 1945. Despite Rupertus's unflattering remarks, the 1st Marines were pushing into some of the worst terrain ever encountered during the Pacific War. The 1st Marines' regimental narrative describes it best. Along its center, the rocky spine was heaved up in a contorted mass of decayed coral, strewn with rubble, crags, ridges, and gulches thrown together in a confusing maze. It was impossible to dig in. The best the men could do was pile a little coral or wood debris around their positions. The jagged rocks slashed their shoes and clothes and tore their bodies every time they hit the deck for safety. Each blast hurled chunks of coral, multiplying many times the fragmentation effect of every shell. In Tothis, the enemy dug and tunneled like moles, and there they stayed to fight to the death. Hunt's men atop the point held out. They fought off repeated assaults by fanatical Japanese. In some places, the enemy dead lay 4 deep. After a terrifying 30 hours, the stranded Marines were rescued. Of the 235 original riflemen that landed, only 78 walked away. Puller's Leathernecks continued to attack. As the days passed, companies were reduced to platoons and were being led by corporals. The Marines soon christened the area Bloody Nose Ridge. The combat in the Umurbrogol was unforgiving. Captain Everett C. Pope, leading Company C, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, was fighting in an area dubbed Walt's Ridge. Throughout the night and into the next day, his men repulsed numerous enemy thrusts. As the fighting became hand-to-hand, the Marines pitched some of their attackers bodily over the steep cliffs, wrote James H. Alice in his account The Devil's Anvil, The Assault on Peleliu. Spotting 2 enemy soldiers climbing the slope to his position, a sergeant heaved an empty grenade box at them, then opened up with his rifle. Private First Class Philip Collins of Gardner, Massachusetts, picked up Japanese grenades before they exploded and tossed them back. He did that until one exploded in his hand, reported Pope. Then he picked up a rifle and used it until he was too weak to load the weapon. On September 21st, Geiger realized that the 1st Marines were through as a fighting unit. "They weren't fire-eaters anymore," remarked one officer. Geiger ordered 1 regimental combat team from the 81st Division to land. Incredibly, Rupertus did not agree and argued that his Marines, if given another day or 2, could finish the job. Geiger disagreed and radioed General Mueller. The 321st RCT was sent to Peleliu to relieve the embattled 1st Marines. The other units on the island enjoyed better success, but casualties mounted. The 1st and 3rd Battalions, 5th Marines, and the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines were poised to seize the airstrip. Riflemen had to attack the position while Japanese gunners, concentrated on the ridges, could look down their throats. As the ranks pressed ahead, bullets snapped and cracked like some unreal thunderstorm. While the infantry trotted across the airfield, the sound of the wounded and dying was unnerving. Cries for corpsmen went largely unanswered, wrote Hallas. Many of the hard-hit Marines bled to death on the hot coral runways before anyone could get to them. Despite the intense barrage, the Leathernecks secured the strip. As the days passed, they moved northeast to capture Peleliu's lower pincer. The RDF was destroyed and 2 islands, Nabad and Island A, were cleared offshore. By September 23rd, the 5th Marines had cut a path all the way to the sea, designated Purple Beach. The division made this a rest area, if such a thing could be found on Peleliu. During the evening of September 23rd-24, General Inoue attempted to bolster Nakagawa's forces from Babelthwap. Despite an awesome array of firepower from naval ships and artillery, about 600 enemy troops did manage to make it to shore. They melted into Peleliu's elaborate cave system and were probably killed during the course of the battle. On September 28th, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, conducted an amphibious assault on Ingesibus Island in the north. Artillery preceded the landing and Vought F4U Corsair fighters from VMF 114 strafed the beaches. While Company L over on the eastern portion of the island, Company Cape pushed to the north. By the following afternoon, Ingesibus was in Marine hands. To the south, the 7th Marines advanced against stiff enemy resistance. Company I, 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines ran headlong into 3 concrete dual-purpose gun positions. Nothing could dent this position, and finally combat engineers, hidden by smoke grenades, set charges to demolish the structure. No single man contributed more to the effort to eliminate enemy strongholds in the southern area than PFC. Arthur Jackson of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. The burly 19-year-old barman from Alaska kept Japanese defenders pinned down while he pitched white phosphorus grenades and satchel charges into the apertures and eliminated position after position. In all, he destroyed 12 bunkers and killed 50 enemy soldiers. He would be awarded the Medal of Honor and subsequent promotion to 2nd Lieutenant for his exemplary bravery. Within 3 days, the 7th Marines had removed most of the enemy from the southern end of the island. Hannigan sent a message to Division Headquarters. At 15:20, 01 was taken. The 7th Marines' mission on Peleliu is completed. The respite for the 5th and 7th Marines, unfortunately, was a temporary one. With the departure of the battle-weary 1st Marines, Rupertus ordered every able-bodied rifleman into the desperate struggle for the Umurbrogol. Time dragged on for the weary infantrymen entangled in the mountainous spine of Peleliu. Naval gunfire proved to be useless against the coral bastion, and 75mm howitzers were manhandled up some of the cliffs to provide support for the infantry. In what probably were some of the shortest bombing runs of the war, Corsairs dropped tons of napalm in the Umurbrogol. The gasoline and jelly mixture, something new to the Pacific War, stripped the ridges clear of their vegetation. Now the ugliness of the Umurbrogol could be seen by all. "Every Marine fighting in those hills is an expert," remarked Major Gardengale of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. "If he wasn't, he wouldn't be alive." By mid-October, the Marines on Peleliu were through as a combat unit. They stumbled toward the shore, barely carrying their weapons to be transported to the ships lying in wait. Most stared blankly while others broke down and cried. They had survived a living hell, while thousands of their fellow Marines had not. Soon, Mueller's Wildcats arrived on the island and took over for the Leathernecks. The fighting, however, was far from over. Nakagawa would make the soldiers pay for every inch of Peleliu. It was an infantryman's fight. It was the individual riflemen, armed with satchel charges, grenades, and explosive devices, who finally reduced the Umurbrogol to a pocket 900 yards long by 400 yards wide. The soldiers and Marines had christened certain areas of this stone mass with names like China Wall to the north, Walt Ridge, Boyd Ridge, and unnamed ridge to the south, the Five Sisters, Death Valley, and Hill 300 looming to the east. The western part included Waddy Ridge, Baldy Ridge, the Knobs, and Ridge 120. And in the midst of all these terrain features were the Five Brothers, the Horseshoe, and Wildcat Bowl. The 321st and 323rd RCTs moved in to continue reducing the Umurbrogol pocket. The 306th Engineer Battalion was able to erect a coral ramp from the bottom of Wildcat Bowl to the top of China Wall so artillery and supplies could get to the soldiers fighting there. The 81st Division inched its way forward, eliminating cave after cave. The Horseshoe area, named so by the Marines, was rechristened Mortimer Valley after Captain Joseph F. Mortimer of the 323rd RCT, who was killed there. On the evening of November 24th-25, about 45 Japanese soldiers were killed in a violent final stand on Peleliu. It was later learned from a prisoner that Nakagawa and Mirai had sent the men forward. They burned the regimental colors and each placed a bullet in his head. At 11 a.m. on November 27th, over 2 months after the initial landing, Colonel Arthur P. Watson, commanding the 323rd RCT, informed General Mueller that Peleliu was secured. The enemy had fulfilled his determination to fight to the death, he said. The cost to seize Peleliu was astronomical in terms of human life. Only 302 of the enemy had been taken prisoner, and most of these were laborers. The rest died or were buried alive in the caves. The Marines suffered a total of 6,526 casualties, 1,252 killed, 5,157 wounded, and 117 missing. The 81st Infantry Division sustained 1,393, 208 killed, and 1,185 wounded. The steadfastness of the enemy was apparent as illustrated in the Japanese manual Palau Sector Group Training for Victory. It is certain that if we repay the Americans, who rely solely upon material power with material power, it will shock them beyond imagination. With the exception of the memories of its participants, the Battle of Peleliu remains a footnote in history. The individual soldier or Marine does not concern himself with strategy. His is a personal battle fought face-to-face with a determined enemy. The only thing that mattered was survival. And it was never more apparent than on Peleliu.